Hello, we shall discuss on this topic why Sargasso as a neo-Victorian fiction. Let's start. First of all, what is neo-Victorianism? Neo-Victorianism is a trend that appeared in the latter part of the 20th century and has been continuing. It's an attempt to emulate the aspects of Victorian times or attempt to connect to the Victorian past in several ways. It can be done in terms of architecture, craft, in literature, in several ways, I said. So, according to Kate Michel, History, Culture, and Memory in Neo-Victorian Fiction, as she said in this book, Neo-Victorian fictions are historical texts. Now, why? Because these texts attempt to represent the past. According to her, these texts are historical fictions because these texts return to the Victorian era stylistically and thematically and try to criticize the past in several ways. Anne Hellman and Mark Lelwyn, in their book Neo-Victorianism, however, said that these Neo-Victorian fictions are not exactly the historical texts. Why? According to them, historical text would just represent some important historical events and represent some historical personages, but not necessarily this Neo-Victorian text would represent some important incident in history. They can just represent certain household stories of the Victorian times or represent the Victorian manners and the Victorian times or can connect in Victorian past in several ways. For example, in A.S. Pyatt's position, the actual setting is late 20th century, but in this particular text you can find uh, there, there is a researcher who is trying to connect, who is trying to find out the relationship between two Victorian poets. So basically, there is a difference between Neo-Victorian fiction and a historical text. Why? Because historical text would always try to represent some important incident of history and would try to represent some historical personages. But Neo-Victorianism would uh, mean that the text would try to connect to the Victorian times or try to represent the Victorian times in several ways. Not necessarily some important historical events would be represented, but the very common incidents of Victorian times or the Victorian story or the story set in Victorian times that can also be a neo-Victorian text. So it is not necessarily representing some important historical events or connecting to some important historical incidents. Cora Kaplan, in her book Victoriana: Histories, Fictions, and Criticisms, has named this late Victorian century nostalgia for the Victorian times as Victoriana. Now, this term, Victoriana, was first used by Ezra Pound. She appropriated this term to define the contemporary trend of representing the Victorian times or the popular Victorian nostalgia. Obviously, there are certain alternative names for this Neo-Victorianism. One is, as Cora Kaplan said, it is Victoriana, Retro-Victorianism, Post-Victorianism. These are alternative names for Neo-Victorianism. Victorianism and Neo-Victorianism. As I said, Neo-Victorianism is an attempt to reprise the Victorian times or to connect to the Victorian times in several ways and sometimes an attempt to emulate the aspects of the Victorian times. But Victorianism in general would refer to the negative attributes of the Victorian times. What are the negative attributes? Ethnocentrism, the belief that their culture is the most superior one. Racism, they believe that the whites and the Europeans are the most superior race. Sexual piggishness, their intention to connect their sexual desires and acts to the morality. Gender biasness, they believed that women are for the interior works of home, and they were very much patriarchal. Rigidity in manners and dress codes, they had always certain dress codes for several events, and certain rigid manners. So these are Victorianism, basically the negative attributes you see. But Neo-Victorianism is an attempt to reprise the Victorian aspects. Obviously, it can be that a text is representing the negative attributes of the Victorian times or Victorianism, and a text in general trying to reprise the Victorian times in unique ways. So, Victorianism would refer to the negative attributes of the Victorian times, and Neo-Victorianism an attempt, particularly contemporary attempt, to connect to the Victorian times in several ways. White Sargasso Sea that appeared in 1966 was the first popular Neo-Victorian text. Before that, Robert Graves produced one Neo-Victorian text. The name of this text is The Real David Copperfield. But this White Sargasso Sea was the first popular Neo-Victorian text. And you know that this text connects to the popular story by Charlotte Bronte, that is Jane Eyre. But the trendsetter of Neo-Victorianism is the French Lieutenant Salmon by John Fowles that appeared in 1969. Now, this is the book because of which we sometimes try to connect this Neo-Victorianism to the postmodernism. So, this French Lieutenant Salmon was the trendsetter of the Neo-Victorianism, and you can find that the setting is Victorian times. Sarah Woodruff is the character here. She is the French Lieutenant Salmon, and the setting is the Victorian times. It's fine, but the structure of this text is very much postmodern. You can find three alternative endings towards the end. These are the names of some popular Neo-Victorian texts: A Spy's Possession and the Children's Book, Sarah Waters' Affinity and Fingersmith, Gail Jones' 60 Lights, John Harwood's The Ghostwriter, Tubby Scares, The Things About the Thugs. And you can find there are numerous Neo-Victorian texts. Particularly, you can find a contemporary trend of connecting a Victorian story to the supernatural machineries, that is, including some vampires or werewolves uh, to the main plot of Victorian stories, and in the process, reprising a Victorian story. Now, this is the most popular trend here. These are some popular adaptations of the Neo-Victorian fictions, and these are some examples of Neo-Victorian uh, movies and television series. For example, The Prestige. The Prestige is a Neo-Victorian movie. Young Victoria is a Neo-Victorian movie. Actually, all of them are Neo-Victorian movies, but some of them are adaptations of Neo-Victorian texts. For example, Fingersmith, you can find Affinity. These two texts are by Sarah Waters. Not only the Neo-Victorian text, but also the cinematographic adaptations of the Neo-Victorian text and Neo-Victorian movies, the reproduction of Neo-Victorian movies. These are the reasons that that work behind this popular Victorian nostalgia in the contemporary times. Neo-Victorian fiction and historical text. I have already defined that. Kate Mitchell said Neo-Victorian texts are historical fictions, but you can say not necessarily. Obviously, a Neo-Victorian text can be a historical fiction if it does connect to a, significant historical event or represent Victorian personage, but not necessarily a Neo-Victorian text would be a historical text. It depends. Now, why White Sargasso is a Neo-Victorian text? First of all, it does connect to a Victorian story, that is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. Particularly, this is the backstory of Bertha Mason, a character in Jane Eyre, and the setting is post-emancipation Jamaica that was colonized by British. That was a British colony at that point of time. You can find several British characters in that text. Uh, for example, Mr. Mason, Edward Rochester, and you can find the representation of Victorian hypocrisy, Victorian manners in this particular text. So these are the reasons that we consider White Sargasso is a Neo-Victorian text. And obviously, it does represent the negative attributes of the Victorian times also. For example, racism, sexual prejudice, their dress codes, and there you see ethnocentrism. So there are certain reasons behind considering this White Sargasso as a Neo-Victorian text, not necessarily because it is connecting to Jane Eyre, uh, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, but there are also certain other reasons. Okay, these are the references. Thank you.